My name is Deborah Valentine. I'm the organizing coordinator with Communications Workers of America, Local 1180, Public Sector. Today I'm going to introduce Janella Hinds, Secretary Treasurer of the New York City Central Labor Council. Janella is a public school teacher, and she's also the vice president of UFT. Everybody welcome Janella Hinds.
Good morning, sisters and brothers. How are you? It is great to see you all this morning. And I am honored to have the opportunity to chat with you all about this attack on working people. My eyes look moist, not because I've been crying, although there is a lot to be upset about. It's just a little windy outside, so it'll take me a minute to settle. But I am very excited about this opportunity to talk with you all today. So this Janus thing that we've been worried about and stressed about and concerned about. The issue is, how does this new attack on working people bring us together to fight back, to create a new labor movement, to create a different way of thinking about what organizing and mobilization looks like? I think that's the issue before us today, right? And we're going to talk about the ins and outs of Janus, and we're going to talk about some of the ways that working people have already taken steps to bring people together. But I just wanted to take a couple of minutes this morning to think about how our enemies have really brought themselves together over the last 40 years to tie our hands, to break our backs, to put tape over our mouths, right? And they've done that in the voting booth, and they've done that with regard to reproductive rights, and they've done that with regard to the ability of people who are newcomers to this country to move around. Now with this new tax bill, they're trying to tie the hands of students and educators, right? And so when we, gerrymandering, right? And so
they took the advantage of the electoral college court.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, and when we're talking about voting rights, yeah, we're talking about voting rights as one attack, but this attack on working people is a space for all of us as people in labor to come together and to fight in a way that's unique to us. The question before the Supreme Court is, should Abood versus the Detroit Board of Education be overruled, right? Abood has been the law of the land for the last 40 years. And as we talk as working people, I found that some of us don't really understand what all that means. So if you can indulge me, let me just talk for a couple of minutes about what it means to pay your fair share. The labor movement does work on behalf of all working people. We lift all boats. But when we're involved in negotiations, when we are across the table with the employer to make sure that working conditions are safe, when we are working on professional development, all of those tasks cost. And what the Abood decision said, what the Supreme Court previously ruled, is that you don't have to be a member of a public sector union, but you do have to pay for that work. You have to pay your fair share. 2 years ago, in the Friedrichs case, Friedrichs versus California Teachers Association, that group of teachers came together and said, well, we think that this payment of union dues and this membership is in fact compulsory, and we think that that is a violation of our First Amendment rights. We know that's all malarkey, right? We know that's all foolishness, and we know that it really is about the ability of working people to come together and to fight. But they found this angle, and they're trying to use this to come against us. And we dodged a bullet when Scalia passed, right? And everybody, I remember being up in Albany, and the word going around the egg when people were talking, Scalia's dead, what does this mean? What does this mean? And I think for many of us, we kind of exhaled, right? And we said, all right, well, we're good now. Everything's okay. We'll be all right. We know they're coming, but we're good now. Meanwhile, the enemies were planning and plotting. They've had the cases in the pipeline. And so now we're here with the Janus case, Janus versus AFSCME. And once again, it's a case where they are arguing that membership in a union, payment of those dues, is a violation of First Amendment rights. But we know that if there is no struggle, there is no progress, right? Frederick Douglass told us this struggle may be a moral one or it may be a physical one. It may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. We know that. We know that, and we know that the work has to be done for our members and among our leadership and together to ensure that we are all on the same page regarding this case. I can take your comment, and let me just wrap up what I need to say, okay? And so we have this opportunity in public sector unions to talk to members about what it means to be a unionist. And I find this as a new opportunity for us to think about unionism, for us to think about what it means to resist and to care. There is this work that could be done about political activism, the choice we make to make our voices heard, to work together, to identify our priorities. This summer, DC 37 began holding lunchtime information sessions all over the city. Do we have any members of DC 37 in the house, right? And we know that you all have been having some conversations about issues like the Constitutional Convention, which we all deserve a big round of applause for. Because our opponents were mobilized against us, and just a year ago, when union members were polled about the Constitutional Convention, 62% of them said they would vote in favor of it. And we ended up over a week ago with over 80% of New York voters voting it down, right? And that's because of us. That's because of the work we did, talking to each other, educating each other, pulling people along, making sure that people got to the ballot, got to vote, and turn that ballot over, right? Make sure you turn that ballot over and vote no. My union, the UFT, is now engaged in a door-knocking initiative. We have UFTers in the house as well. Woo-hoo. So we are engaged in a door-knocking initiative. We are going to every single member's door to talk to them, to listen to them, to find out how they're doing, and to ask them if they would be willing to recommit. Because the biggest issue with this campaign, I think, is about getting people to want to be members of a union. Right? We're moving this away from the union is my umbrella that I pull out on a rainy day, to the organization that brings me pride, where I know that working together with my colleagues, with my sisters and brothers, that we together can fight the good fight and bring about the changes that we know need to be brought about in this society. But that takes time, and that takes work, and that takes everybody's partnership. And so I see this fight as this opportunity for us to have the loudest, clearest voice that our members hear. The voice that drowns out all of the noise that they're hearing the pundits spew on all of the talk shows, right? The noise that they're reading in the newspaper or scrolling by on Facebook and Twitter. That we become the voice of reason and we take back the opportunity for people to want to work with their union. With pride, walking around saying, I am a unionist. I am a member of a union, and I'm proud to say that. We haven't always been successful in breeding that pride, right? We haven't always taken that opportunity to share with our members the fights that we've won. We haven't always gone through the details of the challenges that we faced. But now's the time for us to do that. That takes bravery. That takes courage. Now's the time for us to engage in that kind of work. And so I will just share with you as I wrap up that as a high school educator, and that's my daytime gig, as a high school educator, I see the challenges that are before our young people. Many of you as parents of teenagers may experience this too, right? That they're in a world that's moving very, very quickly. Information is coming at them from all angles, and they may, in some cases, feel completely overwhelmed by all of that. And what we as a labor movement have the opportunity to do is fight for a society where they will be safe, where they will be strong, will lay the foundation for them to create a society in which they can become magnificent and powerful and amazing. And so I thank you all for the opportunity to open up this morning, and I look forward to seeing you this afternoon.
Here at the Murphy Institute, and I also want to welcome you to this important event and thank Janella for those fantastic opening words for us. So I just want to get a sense of who's in the room before I start introducing our fantastic panel. How many of us, and I'm going to actually ask you to stand, so if you have your desks out and you feel like you can stand, you should put the desks away. How many of us here are from a public sector union? And you stand up if you can. It's good to see, good to get the blood flowing. All right, great to see, great to see. All right, you can say it. You're gonna stand up a couple more times. How many are from private? Are brothers and sisters from private sector? Woo! Fantastic. As Janella said, we need maximal solidarity, and what is coming for us is coming for them, and vice versa. And it's really great that we're all in here together. I'm going to ask, how many here are member leaders? How many people are? I mean, if you're a member, you're a leader, as far as I'm concerned. So, how many people are members of their unions? Electeds, delegates, rank and file. Fantastic. So great to see. And how many of us are staffers? How many folks work for the unions? Help us keep them strong. It's great. All right, well, I have one last thing to ask in the spirit of the day, which is, how many of us are ready? Well, maybe not ready. How many of us are committed to be ready to face the onslaught that we know is coming and that we are within, and that we're going to make us stronger and more unified, and we're going to transform the unions the way Janella was talking about? That is great. All right, well, thanks again for being here. We're going to hear from 3 speakers this morning, and in between each speaker, we're going to have a little break for us to just talk amongst ourselves, and then we're going to have longer time for discussion after our 3rd speaker. So I'm just going to introduce our first speaker today, Ruth Milkman, my friend and colleague from the Murphy Institute. Ruth is a renowned labor scholar, author of many books. Most recently, her latest book is called On Labor, Gender, and Inequality. But you also might be familiar with her fantastic co-edited book with our own Ed Ott, New Labor in New York. New Labor in New York, right? Yes. Ruth is the research director here at the Murphy Institute, and she is going to be speaking to us about the roots of the right to work attack that we are facing. So thank you, Ruth.
Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really impressed by the turnout. It's great, and we need it. I have a PowerPoint that's supposed to be appearing from somewhere. It's coming. Can you hear me okay? Closer? Is that better? While I'm waiting for the PowerPoint, I just want to say I can vividly remember, there are these historical events where you always remember where you were, 9/11. Some of us are old enough to remember when Kennedy was shot. And I remember Friedrichs. I was in Washington, D.C. waiting for a train at the Amtrak station, and I heard somebody on the cell phone right in front of me saying, Friedrichs, Scalia. So he got off the phone, and I was like, what happened? And he turned out to be, I don't know his name, I'm sorry, maybe he's in the room. He was a TWU official on his way back to New York like I was. So I heard immediately, basically, and I still remember that. Oh, you have to get up here. All right. Thank you. Am I going to be able to see it right here, too? Is that part of the deal?
Which one is yours? Can you see
Oh, that's it, yeah.
This one
Thank
right
you. Can you make it the whole screen, though?
Yes. Then you just move from right here. You can see from right there as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, I guess we're ready to go. If you might want to pay attention to the screen because I'm going to put up some numbers that I'm not going to have time to repeat. I was asked to give you some historical background on what underlies this whole thing. I think, as Janelle said earlier, we know that the right is newly feeling its power and on the offensive in a deep way. But Janus actually has much deeper historical roots. And so I'm going to just try to sketch the big picture a little bit in the brief time I have with you this morning. So the first thing is just the background of the long, relentless process of declining unionization levels in this country. And that actually dates back to the 1950s, which was the peak of union density, meaning the proportion of all workers who are union members in this country, when it was 35%. And there were hardly any public sector union members at that time, so that was also the private sector density level compared to, as it says here, 6.4% in the private sector today. That's a pretty big come down. And this has been, it really takes off in the 70s, but this process has been ongoing for more than half a century, so we should know that. And it didn't just happen. There's been a long process, as I'll try to sketch for you, of attacks on unionism. There are a lot of people in this country who never liked unions and don't want them to exist and don't want them to be powerful. And so Janus is, only the latest chapter in that long history. Another index besides the decline in union membership that we might point to in trying to understand the plight of organized labor today is the declining frequency of strikes. I'm going to show you a graph on that in a moment. That's really since the 70s. There were quite large numbers of strikes up through the 70s, and then it basically collapses, partly because employers figured out how to do replacement worker. You all know what that means. This is more of a private sector phenomenon. It actually had been legal before, but it's in the 70s when they really start doing that regularly, and strikes are basically destroyed as a labor weapon and even become an employer weapon in some situations. Some of you may know of cases, I do, where an employer directly provokes a strike at the time of a contract expiration, making an offer they know the union can't accept, and then uses that to destroy the union or weaken it further. So that's another index of where we're at. And then, more relevant in a way to Janus, by last year, 28 states, a majority, had private sector so-called right-to-work laws. You know what those mean. I don't need to define that for this audience. That's a lot, 28 states. Okay, it's not what it sounds like. Right to work means that you have the right not to join a union in the workplace. Yes, thank you. It's this is a private sector phenomenon, but Janus is essentially the public sector equivalent. So we'll get to that in a moment. And then more generally, especially since 2010, attacks on public sector collective bargaining have really ramped up in recent years. And of course, Wisconsin is the poster child for that. I'm sure you all remember the horrible story about Scott Walker and we're going to hear it in more detail in a little while. Right, so I'm not going to detail that, but that it's important though. And so, and if Janus is decided in the way we all expect, barring another timely death or something like that, Wisconsin, could you please hold your fire for a while? I think you're interfering with people's ability to hear us, okay? So I know you're enthusiastic and that's great, but we need quiet. If Wisconsin is essentially the specter or the kind of preview of what's going to happen nationally with Janus, the entire public sector will essentially be right-to-work territory if this all unfolds as we expect it to. So here's a few graphs just to summarize what I just said. This is public sector at the top and private sector at the bottom. So as you can see here, this goes back just to the mid-'70s. Private sector unionization has been declining for ages. That's not a new development. Public sector unionism until now has been stable, flat, right? It's been the one sector of the labor movement that has not been in free fall in this period. And that's exactly why they're going after it. So I won't say more, but I'm sure we'll talk about that in the course of the day. Here's the data on strikes. So I only start with the 70s, but look at that collapse in the numbers of strikes. And some of those, like I said, are not really labor offensive strikes. And these are the data for Wisconsin. This is probably the single most sobering graph I'm showing you today. This shows the level of unionization in the state of Wisconsin since the 2010 is the 46.6% level mark there, and now it's 30.9%. That's a pretty dramatic decline in only 4 years, and probably will continue. I just read a paper on the effect, for those of the teachers in the room, the effect of the Wisconsin situation on the quality of education and teaching that I highly recommend. It's from the Center for American Progress, and it's another devastating story of the effects of this kind of thing. Teacher turnover goes up, quality of classroom teaching goes down, et cetera. I mean, you can imagine. So this is all quite serious. Okay, so like I mentioned, right to work was originally, the kind of form that this took was the passage of right to work laws. And in 1947, for those of you who know your labor history, you'll know that date is when the original National Labor Relations Act, or sometimes called the Wagner Act after New York Senator Wagner, which was passed back in 1935, it was amended in 1947 by the Taft-Hartley Act. And one of the things that the Taft-Hartley Act permitted was these so-called right-to-work laws that we defined a few minutes ago. And this just lists the states that immediately passed them, right when it became legal under Taft-Hartley. There were actually a couple before that. As you can see, Florida in 1943 had already passed one, but it wasn't clear if it was legal until this Taft-Hartley thing went through. And then, anyway, you can see the list there. And then, between 1951 and 2001, 50 years, half a century, 10 more states followed. So in this period, the right-to-work states are basically in the South. In fact, there's a pretty good match with former slave states, if you take a look, and in the West. The Midwest and the Northeast and California, the sort of strongholds of unionism, historically, were not part of that, but now that has changed. So again, since 2010 is kind of the turning point when the Republicans triumph in state after state, Wisconsin included. You all remember that, I'm sure. And then we see this new wave of new right-to-work laws. So states that I myself anyway, never thought I would live to see this. Indiana and Michigan. Michigan, the birthplace of the UAW, has a right-to-work law. How did this happen? That was such a wake-up call for anybody paying attention. Wisconsin has that too, in addition to the public sector law I already mentioned. West Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri. Missouri is actually having a referendum next year, which, with any luck, will lead to the repeal of this measure, but we don't know how that's going to come out yet. So there's a lot of states. Here's the map. So Janus. So just in case you haven't been following the details, I'll just review very quickly what this is about. The plaintiff, the sort of nominal plaintiff, I should say, because he's got big, powerful organizations behind him, is a guy called Mark Janus, who's a public sector worker in Illinois. His legal fees for this case are being paid for by the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. and a group that's been around for some time. It was founded in 1968, and it in turn is a kind of subsidiary of a group called the National Right to Work Committee, founded in 1955. I can't emphasize how long these folks have been waiting for this moment. And then another outfit just local to Illinois called the Liberty Justice Center, which is kind of Orwellian name for what it is. So their goal, as Janelle mentioned earlier, is to reverse a historic Supreme Court decision back in 1977 in the Abood case, which essentially said agency fees, or fair share fees if you prefer, are appropriate, legal, that's the law of the land. Since 1977, there's no ambiguity about that, except now it's being challenged again, as it was in Friedrichs. And there was another case in between, which I know we're going to hear about from our next speaker, Kim. In 2014, some of you will remember this Harris v. Quinn, which sort of nibbled at this issue, but we're still waiting, basically. Janus is going to be the real clincher here if it goes through as planned next spring, very soon. So what is at stake? Some of you picked up this report that Stephanie Luce and I produce year after year on union density in New York. Here in New York, I'm just going to say, our situation is quite a bit better than the rest of the country, and that's detailed in the report. Here, about 70% of public sector workers are unionized. That's like double the national level. But we don't know what Janus means for that. So there's a lot at stake here. I also want to emphasize, and I hope this will be a topic of conversation because I don't have time to get into it here, that if you think about who works in the public sector, who are the members of these unions who stand to lose the most here, it's women and people of color, and of course women of color. Not immigrants, interestingly, because often for a lot of public sector jobs, you either have to be a citizen or speak perfect English or whatever. So immigrants are underrepresented, but the other groups I mentioned are overrepresented in the public sector. So that's who stands to lose the most. And if you think about things like the gender gap in pay or the racial gap in pay, they are smaller in the public sector precisely because of union power. So it's not just that people will lose their union protections, which they might, but they'll also lose that. So it couldn't be bigger stakes. Nationally, even though public sector unionism, public sector is about 15% of all workers in the country, it's about 3 times that. 45% of union members are in the public sector. Teachers are almost a third, about 30% of all U.S. union members today. That's what this is about. The right wants to destroy the political and economic power that these unions have, and they're going after what's left standing. I know there are private sector union folks in the room, and even in the private sector, New York has double the union density of the country, but that they've already kind of triumphed in the private sector. So this is what's left, and that's what this is about. So as you know, Janus will mean an immediate hit to public sector union treasuries. Anybody who's not already a member as opposed to a fee payer, that money disappears overnight. But once members figure out that they don't have to pay anything and they can still get all the benefits of being in the union and all the coverage and the contract and all the rest of it, there's a good reason to think that unless there's an incredible amount of organizing, which is what we're here to talk about today, you're going to see a lot of long-term erosion. I've even heard a rumor, I don't know if it's true, that some right-wing groups are foiling the membership lists of major public sector unions, and their intent is to send a letter to every member letting them know once the minute Janus comes down that they don't have to pay this money, they can have it for free. This is really scary stuff. But I'm just going to close with a chart that's in your report, so I'm not going to go over it in any detail. I know I'm out of time. About the short-term impact of individual unions here in New York. It actually varies a lot. See this chart, which is also in I don't remember what page, but it's in in that report. What this shows is the numbers of public sector members in various unions. We couldn't get this data from every major union in the city, so there are some conspicuously absent here, but most of the big ones are here. Tells you how many agency fee payers they have according to either public sources or the unions themselves. So, these may be slightly off the accurate, but it gives you an idea. And then the last column is the one that matters. What percent are fee payers as a percent of public union membership? So the immediate challenge is this group. And it could be worse. In other parts of the country, it is worse. Because in most of these cases, between 80 and 90% of folks that are covered by the contracts are actually members already. But again, that could easily unravel. So I'm out of time. I'm going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot I had this. One more thing. This is just to underscore the point about the race and gender stuff. So look at that. This is overall union membership. And finally, Donald Trump, his strategy is divide and conquer. So this is the very first day he was in office. Do y'all remember this? Oh, I have to get closer. Sorry, I couldn't figure out what the sign language was back there. This is a meeting he held with a bunch of the building trades union folks who he's sort of wanted to get onto his side. I don't think that's really survived these last 9 months or whatever it is, but this is maybe why we haven't seen a proposal for a national right-to-work law in the private sector. That may still come. But I think his strategy is divide and conquer, like get the more reactionary, excuse me if I'm offending anybody here, union leaders in the, on his side. That's another one with the police. Okay, I don't have time to say more, but thank you very much.